So I welcome intellectual diversity, and that's why I get drawn to people like Tanveer? Yeah, Tanveer Ahmed. We met online, it's the first time we met in person. Hello. See? And then hug. Strangers, they hug each other. It's okay, we're out. So Tanveer has done extraordinary work being an ambassador for the White Ribbon Campaign, which is a feminist approach to looking at domestic violence. And he came across my radar when he began to talk about this. And he got booted out of the organisation because he was talking about it in the wrong way. And that fascinated me, because there's the dichotomy which says men must speak out about violence against women and girls. And do you know what? They should. I've got an 18-year-old daughter. I care passionately about women and girls being safe. And yes, men should speak out about it. But we should be free to speak out about it in any way we want to. Because we've got something to bring to the conversation. And yet, what happens is when men think for themselves in that conversation, they go, yes, we want you to speak out, but we don't want you to say that. We don't need to think about it that way, we only want you to say it this way. So that's why I was drawn to Tanveer. And he's got, I don't know, I have no idea what he's going to say. He might not even touch upon that, but I wanted to give you the history. I also actually spent a long time moisturising with Dove, listening to your lovely conversation about masculinity on the Dove Men Care podcast, right? So, you know, you've got more depth, haven't you? There's more to you. There's more to you than just that. I was scribbing and exfoliating with my Dove Men Care, listening to Tanveer talking about masculinity. So, you know, we've got depth. So I don't know what he's going to say, but I'm really looking forward to it. It's a pleasure to meet you. I hope I get to know you better. Thank you for being in this conversation. And please welcome Tanveer Ahmed, our last speaker.
No, thank you very much, Glenn. And it's a pleasure to see him in person, as he alluded to. I guess it's a feat of the modern world where you suddenly get connected to people on the other side of the world, and here we are in this room. I'm slightly probably out of place. I'm not sure I feel entirely deserved. Like in some ways I'm an accidental male activist in this arena, and as Glenn alluded to, and I feel slightly inadequate next to the potent Nick Tovey. And someone like David, who's been working in this space, in such a tough space. It's a tough space, and I guess someone else I'd acknowledge too, who I've met through suddenly kind of being thrust into this space, Jasmine, as a great person, as a great example of a woman who's fighting in this space as well. And I know Nick also, thanked rightfully a lot of the women who've come here, because I think it's absolutely critical you get involved in these kinds of issues. Now, I fell into this space largely because I'm a psychiatrist. I work in Western Sydney, and most of you will be local. I guess I have a sort of casual, semi-casual involvement in the press. And a part of being a doctor, you get taught really just simply kind of basic advocacy of patients. Not unlike being a lawyer, I guess. You see a whole range of patients. If I see drug and alcohol patients, it's my job to kind of advocate what policies and what things may help them both as individuals and in a wider sort of policy framework. Likewise, if it's adolescents, of which many I see, if it's different ethnic groups, eating disorders, whatever it may be. Certainly where I am in Western Sydney, I guess it's certainly politically in Australia, it's arguably the area. If there was one single area of Australia that determines Australian politics, it would be Western Sydney. And really it encompasses a lot of the big forces, political forces. So largely Western Sydney is traditionally white working class, increasingly new immigrants, and as Sydney becomes more expensive, those demographics are rapidly changing. So you see all these sort of modern clashes, be it rapid migration, be it the very rapid decline in manufacturing. And certainly in the last few years, I was seeing almost a steadily increasing number of patients, people sort of falling into that realm, particularly, say, workers' complaints. Suddenly there's a factory shuts down, someone in their sort of mid-40s, early 50s, male, suddenly turns up and kind of stuck. Got this real sense of just being stuck. And here they were presenting into mental health framework. But while I had some to offer, you really felt like there were these broader forces that had kind of left many men, like some of these patients, with nowhere to look in a way. And that started getting me very interested. Likewise, in the realm of immigrants. You go from suddenly sort of clan very traditional cultures suddenly thrust into the urban West, and then trying to make sense of distress and how to channel that, and having sort of entirely new idioms, going from a world of, say, tradition, religion, clan, to suddenly kind of New Age thinking, this Woody Allen psychotherapy, like all this kind of stuff. It's such rapid changes enforced in our world now, and you throw in communications technology in that, and I really started seeing men almost uniquely affected, particularly those two groups, where it felt like the world was rapidly changing around them, and they were the ones, at least some of these groups, were just watching. They were watching it pass by, and in that respect, I would say masculinity is, in some respects, in what we term masculinity. I guess as a doctor, I certainly think there are aspects of masculinity that are inherent in biology. And I won't necessarily go through all of that. There's no question that gender is in transition, but there are certainly aspects. I don't believe in a pure gender undifferentiation, if you like. Yes, there's no question that we're flexible. There's no question that we are in a degree of transition and we're capable of that. But at the same time, we are unique and we have unique things to bring. But I think in the respect that masculinity, I do think is in some element of crisis. Now, the heart of mental health is really, can you communicate distress in healthy ways? That's really at the heart of mental health. And obviously, I'm a psychiatrist. And we do that healthy ways really by it could be humour, it could be talking meaningfully with a friend, a confidant, it could be channeling it physically through exercise, it could be through the creative work. So it doesn't, talking is really just one aspect. It's probably one of the most powerful aspects, because language is essentially our link with our consciousness, essentially. So in that respect, it's still one of the most powerful ways of dealing with distress. Now, you end up in mental health because you deal with distress in unhealthy ways. And another thing I found, while I would have people coming into my rooms, to be honest, I was far more likely to see men in alternative settings. I was far more likely to see them in the juvenile justice system. I was far more likely to see them in a legal framework. I was far more likely to see them brought in by relatives due to some sort of substance issue when they almost could barely recognise it. So there's all these unhealthy ways that they were more likely to deal with distress and end up at my door, but almost kind of at a loss. They weren't even the ones necessarily seeking help. It was almost broader institutions going, well, there's all these people that kind of need help, and they were almost, if not unaware, not entirely insightful about it too. So in this respect, this is the key respect I would say masculinity is in a degree. I mean, crisis is a strong word, but in terms of the broader changes in the world that are happening so rapidly, arguably masculinity is still, because it's so rigid and it's been so inflexible for let's be honest, for millennia, it's particularly vulnerable at such a stage of rapid changes. And fundamentally, really, a man being, say, a physical worker and emotionally self-contained, a provider and a protector, and sometimes a sacrificial protector. All of these elements are kind of features of history in terms of the place of man, and it's actually quite an inflexible, rigid place, a rigid formulation of what masculinity and what a man is, and I think that's where we've been kind of caught off guard, because everything else is shifting at great speed, and men are struggling to keep up. Well, certainly it's beginning, no question, and we wouldn't be having meetings like this if that wasn't the case. So in that respect, masculinity most definitely is in some form of crisis. It's in a period of transition, but it's behind the eight ball. I guess that's the way I would describe it. And certainly Glenn's alluded to it, that women obviously have moved into a whole set of masculine roles, and men are trying to work out how that might they shift into traditionally female roles. And when we talk about that, that's when we can start thinking about, okay, how might society change? That's when we can start asking those questions. The reality is there's a whole set of ways society must change. Now, coming back to how I fell into this space, because I wrote something, I have some involvement in the press. I wrote something fairly casual, what I felt was just bald-faced observation of men kind of struggling, and how I felt gender relations were changing, and as a result, the nature of family violence in some situation was also changing. But I clearly touched on some sacred cows there, and it was an area that I hadn't necessarily written about. Yet, I've written on more than a few, controversial topics. So I was amazed at the sheer primitive response that came when I wrote about this, and I guess that's where just men changing isn't enough, because it's still embedded in society and politics, and obviously power relations, and I'll come to that in a second. So what ways can society change? So that broad shift of men going into caring roles, how can we do that? So one is individuals teaching boys, teaching our friends, encouraging that sort of culture of vulnerability, likewise in therapeutic spaces, in all of these spaces, really teaching a new culture of communication, which traditionally blokes didn't necessarily have. And the Australian man is arguably the archetypal kind of traditional, kind of emotionally self-contained man. Although in these parts, Glenn, your pink shirt will be perfectly acceptable. I can certainly guarantee that. So in that respect, as individuals, that's that broad change. And I think that's an area that men can control to a degree. That's an area we can control. We're encouraging each other to be vulnerable, to communicate, to try and move into spaces where traditionally men haven't been. The areas where we can't necessarily control, okay, I need to move quickly. All right, let me knock off some bullet points. So one, we know some of the figures around education, work, all of those things. So broad movements we do need. One, things like how, to help men move into some of these spaces, maybe we need a lot of name changes. For example, we don't call air hostesses anymore, they're flight attendants. Likewise, things like nurses or places like teachers, there may need to be a whole shift there. We have entire programs trying to encourage women to go into technology, engineering, finance. We've got few programs trying to get blokes into these other sort of industries, do we? We're very little. The education space is difficult. Boys are struggling there. Now, there's a lot of kind of research into that, and I have two daughters, so I can see that right in front of me. And likewise, I think it goes back to communicating distress. Girls are much more likely to be pleasers with their teachers, etc. Guys, if they become a little bit messy, fall into video games, drug, substance abuse, etc. Again, it's about them not learning how to communicate distress. Now, women need to change too. Often we have traditional ideas around marriage. Increasingly now, working class men, and to some degree newly arrived immigrant men, they're struggling to attract women, they're struggling to maintain marriages. The nuclear family is dying, particularly in the suburbs, in working class groups increasingly. And some of that has to do with women. We've still got traditional ideas of partners and how to marry, all of that sort of stuff. So we almost need to think, guys need to get better at marrying up, women need to get better at marrying down, so to speak. Like that's another sort of key area that we need to shift in. Now, almost out of time, but I think that touches on a few things. There's a whole set of societal shifts that I think we can help. There are some deeper, most difficult issues around politics, and that's a broader shift about men's rights essentially shifting into identity politics, where you look at groups like in the US, particularly the men's rights, they've become another identity group saying we are victims, help us. But and to some extent, it's not entirely untrue. But that doesn't shift the left in particular. Like I certainly didn't. I used to be part of the left, but just randomly kind of speaking observations. Many aspects of the left are still stuck in a 70s view of power relations, i.e., a man can only be powerful. Whatever role you want to think, someone from an ethnic group can only be a victim if you're dark-skinned. So that aspect is the hardest. And that aspect requires straight out fights against politics.